So Walter,
Hometown hero.
As Ted mentioned, Walter and I have some things in common. We grew up in New Orleans. We went to the same high school.
We used to sort of compete as who were sort of the more famous Newman graduate, and then Peyton Manning and Eli Manning came along.
Yeah.
And at best, we're number 3 and 4.
No, Odell Beckham.
And Odell Beckham made that catch, and now we're number 5 and 6. Yeah.
But on the way over here, I called home and talked to my father, and I said, what should I ask Walter? And out of it, the first thing out of his mouth was, how does he explain going from such humble origins to fame? So how do you...
Should I turn that question
we're gonna
around?
Get to Leonardo in a minute, but what is it about? How did you... I've never asked you this question, and we come from... It's not that we came from an anti-intellectual environment, but we came from an environment that would have been indifferent to what we do.
I'll tell you this.
And so,
oh, yeah.
Seriously. So we both came out of that environment, became writers. How do you explain yourself?
Well, first of all, I was talking to Stephen Gotcha, who's out here in the audience, another Newman grad, about when I was very young getting to know Walker Percy, the great novelist from Louisiana. But I was like 9 or 10 years old, and The Moviegoer hadn't been published. It gets published when I'm about 10. And I remember asking his daughter, because we used to all go water ski over at the Chafuncta and the Bogafalaya, what is it your dad does? Because he was always sitting there drinking bourbon and eating hog-head cheese and not doing anything. Said, well, he's a writer. And I said, fine. And then we went back to like trying to catch turtles or whatever you do. And then I finally, The Moviegoer came on my radar screen and I read it. And so I went and so one day after playing around while I was talking to him, and I said, what is it, being a writer? Because I thought, well, you can be an engineer like my dad, or, a lawyer like your dad, or a fisherman like, Thomas's dad. I didn't know you could be a writer. So I said, okay, that's cool. I'm going to be a writer. And then I went to college and got a graduate degree in philosophy, which was next to useless. And I went to the professor I had and said, I want to go into graduate work or be a journalist. What do you think? He said, you'd be a good journalist, which is his way of telling me that I was never going to be a great philosopher. So I went back to our hometown, and I would tell you I worked on the Times-Picayune, but you'd correct me because I worked on the afternoon edition, which was the state's item. It folded into the Picayune. So I basically became a journalist there's a wonderful line in Lord of the Rings, not all who wander are lost, but I was kind of just wandering and hit on journalism, then got to Time magazine, and Evan Thomas, who who was a classmate of mine, we were both at Time and very frustrated about just writing like a page a week. So we said, let's write a book, and we did.
But it's Walker Percy putting the idea in your head that it's
Absolutely.
not preposterous. See, I never met Walker Percy. It never occurred to me I could meet Walker Percy. And in fact, your journey is a little different. It shows you that you can come out of the same place and have very different experiences. This captures the spirit of my New Orleans literary upbringing. When I was working on The Blind Side, I went to Memphis. This is actually the trip that became The Blind Side. And Sean Toohey picks me up at the airport. Sean Toohey ends up being the guy Tim McGraw plays in the movie. Mm-hmm. Sean Toohey, who I'd grown up with from age 5.
Coach Toohey was our coach.
And
his son is
age
Sean.
5 to 18. And he picks me up at the airport. I've not seen him since high school. And I get in the car, and he says, the first question out of his mouth is, so who writes your books? And I said, I write my books. He goes, no. He says, I know your name's on the book, and you write the books. But who actually writes the books? And I said, no, Sean, I sit down and write the books. And he was like, with wonderment, he looked at me, he said, there's no way you wrote a book.
Yeah.
There's no way.
I know.
You sat in the back row in English class with me, and you were a dumb shit just like me.
Yeah.
And there's no way you wrote a book.
But you had an English teacher and so did I, who became an impact on you, which was Teddy Cotonio,
Well, it's true.
who told you to be brave.
That's true. Now, there were lots of people telling me to get outside my comfort zone.
Correct.
But the idea that you would do this, it would have been.
Well, we also, yeah.
So I won't waste all the rest of our time on our
I
job.
think these people are very interested in childhoods in New Orleans.
So I finished this on the plane coming in last night. Started it a week ago. It is spectacularly good.
Thank you.
The second thing my father said to me was, because we're an art history major at Princeton. I was an art history major at Princeton.
Michael, it frightens me because when I realized he's in, I said, wait, he's written all these books on finance and everything else, but he majored in art history.
My father said, ask Walter if he will just defer to you on all matters, Leonardo, because you are trained there and he is not.
Uh-huh.
But this thing is just better than I ever would have expected. It's magnificent from beginning to end.
Thank you.
So what I want to start with is, it's not an obvious subject for you. I mean, it's not an obvious subject for a whole bunch of reasons. You don't speak Italian. You don't read Italian. You didn't.
Well, I now do, but yes.
You were a philosophy major. You don't have. I don't smell a whiff of art historical interest in your past. Your previous subjects are Kissinger and Einstein and Steve Jobs. It's Franklin. I want to come back to your interest in great men. Mm-hmm. But for now, exactly how do you get onto this as a subject?
Well, one reason was I wanted to rescue Leonardo da Vinci from being thought of only as an artist.
Well, back up. How do you even know that he's being misperceived? I mean, how do you...
Because when I was young and started wandering around Europe the way one does, right. I stumbled across, just hitchhiking. Yeah. And I remember hitchhiking, to Paris.
You hitchhiked? All right.
Well, back in those days, you could hitchhike across Europe. It was not undone. It was something you could do. And I stumbled across his notebooks. Now, everybody who's written about Leonardo tends to focus on the 12 great painting masterpieces or so that he does. And I realized that they're just page after page of notebooks, engineering notes that he does. And when I was doing both Steve Jobs and then The Innovators and being at Time Magazine, I knew Bill Gates.
So there's the start.
Yeah, and so Bill Gates bought the Codex Leicester, which is one of the great scientific notebooks of Leonardo. And I realized that everybody I wrote about, starting with Benjamin Franklin, who's a great scientist. We think of him as a doddering dude flying a kite in the rain, right. But those electricity experiments were the most important theoretical and practical experiments of the era, all the way through Steve Jobs, who always ended his product presentation with a street sign showing the liberal arts and technology, saying that's the combination that causes creativity. So I thought, okay, I've got to understand somebody who not only is both an artist and a scientist, both somebody who believes in the humanity and believes in technology, but who makes no distinction between them. And that was true of Ben Franklin, that was true of Steve Jobs, and then the ultimate, and hold up the back of the book if you want, the Vitruvian Man, the guy, yes. Standing naked in the circle in the square, spread eagle, that is, here it is.
There he is.
That is the icon of the connection of science and the arts. Because Leonardo did like 250 anatomical measurements to do it, but he also made it something of unnecessary beauty. And, in fact, if you mind me telling the story a little bit of it real quick, I'll go back. When Leonardo goes to Milan, he runs away from Florence because he hasn't finished two of the paintings he was supposed to finish.
Right. We were
talking about 20-somethings, which I think I have and you will have soon. Right. And how they don't finish things that they're supposed to.
But he never finished them.
Leonardo's father is a notary and gets him about 4 commissions in Florence and notarizes them, 2 of which Leonardo do, and 2 of which Leonardo just bags, Adoration of the Magi and St. Jerome. And so he runs away, basically, to Milan as a musician, as part of a cultural delegation, writes a letter to the Duke of Milan, and it's a job application. It has 11 paragraphs that are numbered. The first 10 paragraphs are, I can build great buildings, I can be a great architect, I can divert the flow of rivers, I can make weapons of war, I'm a great engineer. Only in paragraph 11 he says, I can also paint.
Right.
So he does not think of himself, to get back to your art history and your dad, as just a painter. In fact, when he goes to Milan, he wants to get out of being a painter. And his first real job in Milan is that the Duke and others have the cathedral, and they want a Tiburio, which is this lantern tower on the top. They don't have a lantern tower. And they ask Leonardo, Bramante, all these architects who are there, design one. Now, Leonardo believes that simplicity is the ultimate beauty. If you look at the Milan Cathedral, it is hideous in that regard. Yeah. It is a Gothic monstrosity. Leonardo designs a very simple octagonal Tiburio with his friends. As you notice, they don't build it. They build this. So Leonardo's a little bit annoyed, but he and Bramante decide they've got to figure out how to do a great church design. Now, Bramante did this painting, but it's him, that's Bramante, who is an architect and friend, and this is Leonardo, his friend, wearing the pink and purple because he was a very flamboyant dresser. These are his notebooks written in mirror script. That's how we're absolutely sure that's Leonardo, because it's from left to right, the way he does, because he's a left-hander. And they decide that they're going to do church designs that are really simple, like this, that are circles within squares, and that are, you know, the exact sort of proportional, symmetrical. Leonardo decides that to do it, they read Vitruvius, he has to get the proportions of man right, because there's this newly discovered book, Vitruvius' 10 Books of Architecture, written, you know, in ancient Roman times, but had just been rediscovered, that says, okay, get the proportions of a man, and that makes the proportions of a church. Leonardo is also obsessed with squaring the circle, one of the ancient mathematical problems, which is making a circle the exact same size as a square, using only a ruler and a protractor. So they go to Pavia, and build a much simpler church. But there they actually get to read the manuscript of Vitruvius, and everybody thinks lone artists. No, these are a group of like 5 friends. They're all hanging out, and there's Francesco Di Giorgio, Giacomo Andrea. They all try to mimic, try to show what Vitruvius says, which is make the proportions of a church like the proportions of a man. Leonardo has a new boyfriend at this time who named Salai, and Giacomo Andrea throws a dinner in which are all trying to draw the man in the church, in the circle, in the square. Salai breaks one of the plates and spills wine on some of the drawings. We have it in the notebook. So this is very human, and they do it, and these are not very great artistic things. And then it's Leonardo's turn, and you get Vitruvian Man. It is something of unnecessary beauty. I mean, as you saw, his friends just made stick figures. This is gorgeous. It's also exactly anatomically perfect, every proportion, with the foot there showing the measurement. He also has figured out the squaring the circle. Here's the square. Vitruvius says that in the center of the square is the genitals, but the center of the circle is the navel. And he realizes that the circle has to be slightly higher than the square. So he gets it totally right in that way. And if you look at his face, at the man's face, and you remember that painting I showed, that's Leonardo. It's him standing naked in the world and in the cosmos and in the spirituality of the church, saying, how do I fit in?
So I'm tempted to let you lecture because it makes
no,
my job
I just
a
wanted
lot
to
easier.
do.
However,
I wanted to get in
we
Vitruvian
got
Man.
that in there. But the story from Milan that is. I'm sorry.
It may be me and my no labels
well,
water.
So this guy you draw, this character you draw, is what makes him such a wonderful character is how consistent the character is through time. One of his traits is an almost pathological inability to do what he's been assigned to do. Right? That he takes a commission and he doesn't finish it. And in Milan, he gets there and the Duke asks him to commemorate his father, and with this equestrian statue. And I think that's one of the story of this guy who first thinks I'm going to put the Duke's dad on a horse, and then gets less and less interested in the Duke's dad and more interested in the horse until he's got a 28-foot horse.
Yeah,
and with a little Duke on the back, and it's the most remarkable thing that so one of the things I wanted you to do, see if you could do it. The range of his interest was just breathtaking. It feels as if everything he was out to discover every truth there was, and he stumbles upon a lot of them. He's a premonition of scientific discovery that will happen hundreds of years hence. Can you list, just off the top of your head, a bunch of his interests and discoveries? Like, bounce around.
Yeah, this is a Bill Gates line when he was trying to talk about the book, but he said that Leonardo da Vinci tried to know everything there was to know about everything you could possibly know about the universe, including how we fit into it. So he starts off working for Verrocchio as a painter, but then gets really interested in engineering, like how are we going to put the ball on top of the Duomo, the dome of the Florence Cathedral. And so he does engineering drawings. Then, particularly interesting in this city, which I found in the notebooks and nobody's really focused on, he spends the first 15 years of his career mainly as a theater producer, producing pageants, public spectacles.
Right.
And so he understands not only perspective, but the tricks of perspective. Like if you're putting scenery on the stage, you'd have it recede a little bit faster. It would be curved in to make it, and when you look at the Last Supper, that's what he did. Or you'll have the table slanted, or each gesture will come dramatically. So some of the engineering he starts off with, like that helicopter that's generally famous, people say, oh, look, the cool dude invented the helicopter. You know, that was mainly done it was done to bring the angels down from the rafters during a performance. But that gets him interested in flying machines.
And birds.
So to real quickly answer your question, mainly painting, engineering, hydraulics, the flow of water, diverting the Arno, flying machines, anatomy, because he does the first great dissections, and geology and fossils. Those are his expertise. But even things like optics, the sun, geometry, squaring the circle, and the cool thing about his notebook pages is that paper was a little bit of a premium. So every notebook page, we just have all sorts of, just each one of his infatuations, and then his to-do list, which is, tell us the size of Milan. Ask so-and-so how you would measure the sun. Why do people yawn? Why is the sky blue? And then describe the tongue of the woodpecker, which is my favorite.
But he makes observations about birds that no one's made. The dragonfly.
And it's partly not just being a genius, but just being observant. Like on birds, he decides he has to figure out whether when they're flying, the wings flap up faster or go down faster. You don't have to be Einstein to figure that out. You just have to say, I am going to write in my notebook, I'll observe that. And he discovers in some species it's this way, in some species it's that way. Likewise, the dragonflies. He says, go by the moats in the castle in Milan and look at the four-winged dragonflies and see if the wings alternate or go in unison. And so part of it is useful curiosity, like I might build a flying machine. Part of it is he's just curious for everything.
Can you flash up the drawing? I thought it was the most spectacular drawing, but I'd never seen it, of the fetus.
The fetus in the womb.
Which is it's not a formal drawing, it's a sketch.
In fact, if you have the book, any of you out there, I use it as the frontispiece, meaning when you first get into the book.
But it's the most amazing piece of observation. And how would he have dissected?
No, he dissected 30 humans, but this actually came from dissecting humans, but actually dissecting, because he never dissected a pregnant woman, dissecting a cow that was pregnant and then combining his knowledge of what a human anatomy was like, but what the fetus looks like in a cow. So that's obviously a human, not a cow. The one mistake is that the womb is more circular as it is in a cow as opposed to in a human. But the cool thing about this is I saw it at Windsor Castle, which is where these drawings are. And I asked the very Windsor, you know, I don't know if I won't get into it, but slightly haughty curator there, was that a work of science or was that a work of art that he was doing? And the guy looks at me, Martin Clayton, and says, I do not think Leonardo would have made that distinction. So I was put in my place.
So, all right, let's back up for just a minute to your process, because you developed this interest in Leonardo. When does this happen? How long ago do you start to think of
you know
Leonardo?
Kathy, my wife, quite well, and she did a junior year abroad studying in Florence, or junior year abroad in Florence. I'm not sure she studied much, but so we'd visit Florence all the time. And that's where I first stumbled, actually in Milan, we went up there once, and there's a Codex on the Flight of Birds, which is his notebook on the flight of birds.
And how did you get access to this?
This was in the Bibliotheca Ambrosiana being displayed.
Okay.
I mean, it's right next to where the Last Supper is, and it's on the tourist trail. You go into this beautiful room, and there's glass case after glass case. I go, holy cow, this guy figured out the flight of birds, and he's trying to make flying machines. I thought he just painted that Last Supper.
At what point do you think in your head you could pull this off?
I didn't think I could pull it off, and I think you didn't help me when I told you I was going to do it. So you don't know anything about how you're going to pull this off. And I said, I had done, all these books about people whose creativity came from crossing disciplines as opposed to being siloed like we do with our kids these days. And this was always the Mount Everest, which is, will I be able to climb it? And at a certain point, I realized that if I read the notebooks closely enough, I would bring something to this party, even though great writers like in the 1930s or 40s, like Kenneth Clark, do wonderful, great art history appreciations of Leonardo. I could bring, Kenneth Clark writes, if he hadn't wasted all this time on anatomy and, flight of birds, he could have finished some of these paintings. My thesis in the book, and Kenneth Clark may be right, but I have other thesis, which is the Mona Lisa's smile or anything else. Her smile answers that question, which is, had he not been interested in every pattern of nature and seen the patterns that cross disciplines, he would have been, a Verrocchio, not Leonardo. He would not have been the most creative genius the world's seen.
So let's put up the Mona Lisa, because I was going to talk about this last, but you kind of
can do it wherever you want.
But since
there she is.
Since you mentioned her, there's several things I didn't know about where she's not up there.
I know, but I was going to give you the.
Oh, okay, go ahead. Give me the 5-minute lecture on the Mona Lisa.
I'll give you I'll try to make it 3.
You're like a.
Because it's about the importance of the notebook.
You're already at the point of the book tour where you're like a jukebox. A3.
Here is him, and we have an optician or ophthalmologist in the audience because I talked to him about it. Here's him dissecting the human eye and figuring out the rods and the cones of the retina and how the ones in the very center see sharp detail, black and white detail, whereas the parts of the retina on the side, at least he believed from this, see mainly color and shadows. And so all this is part of that. Secondly, he's done page after page, which is this side, dissecting the human mouth and lips. Every muscle that touches the lips, he does. And he observes something that you and I could observe, but we're not Leonardo, so we forget to, which is that the bottom lip is a muscle, but the top lip isn't.
Speak for your own top lip.
Yeah, well, try to take your top lip and move it out. You can do it with your bottom lip, you can't do it with your top, because it's... And whether the nerves go to the brain or whatever. So he has all these things. Now look at the very top of what, this is the 12th page of his dissection of the human lips. Look at that. In small light chalk, 1503, this notebook page, he starts the first sketch of the greatest smile ever painted. And there it is. So when you get to the Mona Lisa, she has an elusive smile. In fact, besides being so anatomically different from every other smile painted, one of the interesting things is that the very corners of the lips, the very edges, the details turn down slightly. She ain't smiling at you. But the shadows turn up and make it look like it. So if you stare directly at the corner of her lips, she's not smiling at you. The smile exists, but only the less you look for it. And as your eyes wander to her chin or to her cheekbone or her forehead, she starts to smile again. It's totally interactive, done over a 16-year period.
So he carries this picture with him wherever he goes.
Starts in 1503. As you say, he's not very good at helping perform for the patron.
The person presumably who he painted this for never saw it.
The richest woman in Italy, Isabella d'Este, is offering in letters, I will pay you anything for a portrait. And instead, he paints, because he wants to, the wife of a middle-class cloth merchant. Her name is Lisa. And he never gives it to the cloth merchant. It's 1503 in Florence. Then he goes back to Milan. Then he goes to Rome. Then he goes to many other. Ends up in France.
And carts this thing around physically.
And with mule and all of his pack mules, he's carrying this and 3 other paintings. Because as you said, he doesn't sometimes finish things. But partly it's because he just keeps them and he thinks I can always make it more perfect. So he doesn't deliver the commission, but he keeps the Mona Lisa with him until his deathbed.
Explain why she doesn't have eyebrows.
This is an incredibly good question because Vasari, who was almost contemporary, who writes about Leonardo early on, talks about this amazing, wonderful woman and how anatomically beautiful the eyebrows are and how they come out of each pore. And you think, and it's Lisa del Giocondo, he tells who it is and how he got musicians to play for her when she was posing. And you think, this is wonderful, we know everything. And then we say, wait a minute, but she doesn't have eyebrows. And this has caused conspiracy theorists over the years to think, okay, this isn't the real Mona Lisa, or maybe he painted somebody else, or maybe it's not Lisa, and everything else. We finally discovered, and in my book, I hope I give convincing evidence. No, this is Lisa, this is the Mona Lisa. Sometimes all these conspiracies are wrong. But what happened is Leonardo painted, as he did with the Last Supper, over and over again over 16 years. And as with the Last Supper, if you use oil paint over something that's been totally dried, it doesn't stick very well. And he kept redoing the eyebrows, I think. And then at some point, after he dies, this is in the King of France has it, it was cleaned and the eyebrows came off because they were painted over dried oil paint.
You know, it is interesting how he's not suited to the methods of the time in some ways.
Absolutely,
that the fresco, you know, that he couldn't paint a fresco because he couldn't paint. Yeah. He would never execute that quickly. You have to put the wet plaster on and function in the moment. So explain why this.
I mean, that's the Last Supper, and you know, the Duke of Milan decides, man, you got to paint on the refectory wall for me. And the way you paint a fresco is you do it on wet plaster, which means you got to paint each section before the plaster dries. Leonardo, we know from contemporary accounts, he's famous by that. People coming like an audience, like you all, you know, to watch him paint. And he'd sort of bustle in the afternoon in his purple and pink and drama with all of his friends and colleagues. And he'd stand there and he would then make one brush stroke and then leave. And the Duke would go, what, hey, I'm paying you. What am I going to? He says, sometimes people who are working the most seem to be working the least because they are, and it's like how to procrastinate. And it was cool, and he finally gets it done, but it's screwed up because he's using oil on dry plaster, and it flakes.
How much of this is the original?
About like 10%,
right.
And they've just restored it after 16-year restoration. This is a picture of the restored. Most people say the restoration was truly wonderful and miraculous, but a lot of purists say, hey, it's totally fake. I mean, people guessing what he was paying, you know, we have lots of copies of this done contemporaneously by all of his students, so they're just like re-putting it in the way the student showed it. It is, when you go there, I'll do another slide here. This is the refectory room, and it's pretty awesome. It is probably over-restored slightly, but you can see the accelerated perspective that he does knowing how to do a stage performance, the exaggerated gestures, and it's a narrative. Other people were planning moments. Leonardo knew there was no such thing as a moment, that any particular instant contained what happened before and what happened afterwards. It was like a river. It flowed as opposed to every moment. So as Jesus says, one of you shall betray me, you can see it rippling out so that the first set of apostles has heard it first, and they're already saying, is it me, Lord? These are hearing it for the first time. And then it even bounces back, the rippling, so that Christ is now reaching for the institution of the Eucharist as he reaches for the bread and wine. So you're seeing what is a 15-second narrative in an instant of a painting, but done with a theatrical gestures. Most people at a dinner party don't sit all on one side of the table. They don't sit the way this. They don't have these exaggerated gestures. But he walked around Milan and looked at people talking in the plaza and said, okay, how do I make their motions match their inner emotions? So that was him doing it. It's an absolutely unbelievably great painting, but like a lot of Leonardo, it's screwed up a bit because it's oil paint on dry plaster.
It didn't occur to me while I was reading it, but now it occurs to me. How many paintings did he finish and deliver complete to patrons?
Probably 14, which is very few.
No. How did he survive?
Well, he worked and had good patrons. The Medici,
people were very indulgent.
They were very indulgent, but he was not the favorite of the Medici, which is why he leaves Florence, sort of as a second-tier Newman graduate or whatever.
You know, are you talking about when he leaves, when Michelangelo shows up?
No. The first when he leaves the first time. He gets to Milan, and as I say, the Duke, at first, he wants to be an engineer and does weapons of war for the Duke, which are somewhat fantasy. They never.
Did any of them ever get made?
Yeah, some. The wheellock gets made. Some others. This is a giant crossbow, but no.
And someone tried to build this.
They tried to build it recently, and it doesn't quite work. So he blurs the line between fantasy and reality. But he does make money as a military engineer. Mainly makes money as a theater producer for the pageants and plays in Milan, but also as an architect. And then eventually, the Duke realizes he's mainly a painter, despite what he keeps telling me, and he does a lot of mistresses of the Duke of Milan.
So while we're on
some
that,
of them,
I just want you to tell the story about the story about attributing the painting, the Principessa.
La Bella Principessa.
Yeah.
There are two paintings of our time, or two works. One, the first, is La Bella Principessa, which is actually a chalk drawing, and that's it there. And these are two works of Leonardo that in the past 30 years have been rediscovered and attributed to Leonardo. And there's a great industry at this, which is, I'm being emailed by a lot of people, I've got a real Leonardo, and I'm going, yeah, sure.
If it's a Leonardo, what's it worth?
This one, I'm sure is $100 million, but Salvador Mundi will be which is selling it.
But it starts in
it
someone
starts
buying
at what,
it.
$100 or something? Somebody buys it in a Madison Avenue shop. It's attributed to a follower of Leonardo or to a German painter trying to copy Renaissance paintings. Somebody sees it, wants to buy it in a shop on Madison Avenue, a guy named Silverman, who is in the book, and he doesn't get it because somebody pays $150 for it. But then a few years later, he's able to get it, and then he sets about trying to prove it is actually Leonardo. And there are a few experts. You start with the connoisseurs, meaning Luke Sison at the Met, Martin Kemp at Oxford, who, through connoisseurship, can say, yeah, I'm looking at it. It's a Leonardo. Then there's more technical things, like Leonardo's left-handed, so he uses left-handed hatching. He blurs the lines with a sfumato. You get that. Then you get to the scientific stuff.
Which is the whole new.
It just goes on forever.
But talk about the scientific stuff, because it seems to me that an awful lot that's in your book, that Kenneth Clark didn't have this available.
Right, and now we can look at the underdrawing, we can take the vellum, we can do infrared and multispectral analysis. And one of the things about Leonardo is that he smudged some of the lines because he doesn't believe they're distinct lines in nature, and he uses his thumb, so occasionally you see a thumbprint. So late into this, we're going to try to authenticate it. I won't say the name. I'm a little bit worried about legal stuff, but it's in the book, and I'm very careful. There's a guy who's a semi-famous fingerprint expert in Canada, and he looks at it, and he studies it for a while, and for lots of consulting fees or whatever, declares, I have found the fingerprint, it's Leonardo. So that becomes definitive. There are headlines about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and all the, fingerprints prove a Leonardo. Then a guy named David Grann, a great writer you probably know for The New Yorker, exposes this fingerprint expert as a fraud and gets sued by him, which is why I'm being a little bit careful here. But he
wins the lawsuit.
Wins the lawsuit. So the lawsuit gets tossed out. So all this is in the book, all the twists and turns of authenticating a Leonardo. So then everybody says, well, it's not a Leonardo. This guy was a fraud. But Martin Kemp then finds in Warsaw, Poland,
Do you have a picture of the book?
No, but there's called the Sforziad, which is Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan. It was a history of his family. It had been given to a daughter that married Bona Sforza, the famous, ends up marrying some Polish, king. And this was cut out of the book, and they find it in the Warsaw Library, the book, where it's clearly, the frontispiece has been cut out, and it's clearly by Leonardo. So it gets proven that it is a Leonardo.
What's the other one? You said there are two.
The other is very famous. In fact, at the moment, past 3 days, it's been exhibited in San Francisco. And I just was reading a story in the Chronicle about huge long lines and people fighting to see it. And this is it. It is an absolutely gorgeous picture called Salvator Mundi, Savior of the World. And it was, once again, bought for about $200 by somebody who was convinced it was a real Leonardo. We know Leonardo did this painting in a way. He did a Salvator Mundi because all of his students copied it, and Wenceslaus Haller did an engraving of it. So over the years, and we can trace it to about 1720, I think, when King whatever and Duke of Buckingham sold it. Is that, you probably remember this better, no?
No, that's all right. Keep going.
And so it's lost, but then somebody finds this and claims it's the real thing. And once again, sets about finding Martin Kemp and the infrared analysis and everything else to prove this is the original Leonardo, Salvator Mundi. And now by total consensus, it is, or I say almost total, because there are lots of articles in the papers, some of which have used something in my book to claim it's not Leonardo. And I'll explain, in fact, there's something in Art News and The Guardian today, quoting the book, because this is going on sale on November 15th at Christie's. And it has a minimum of 100 million, but it'll go for 150, which, by the way, is not a lot of money compared to, you could buy boats and other things like that. You can have the only Leonardo in private hands, because no other Leonardo's in private hands, and this is a great one. One of the things about it is it's a typical sfumato, very blurred lines, but the fingers are very distinct here.
And so the blurred lines is it's an innovation that he introduces. The idea that painting you should blur rather than make the lines distinct.
He calls sfumato,
right.
Which you can explain what it is, but it's partly because he understands optics, which is we have two eyes, retina, so we never see an actual sharp line. And secondly, he had a lot of theories that were scientific about there's no sharp lines in nature, but the hand is pretty sharp, and so people said that couldn't be Leonardo. He wouldn't do it that sharp. One of the things I say in this book is that he was at that very moment studying perspective, but not just perspective like perspective lines that were seen. He had what was called acuity perspective, which means when something gets to a certain point, like about right here, it gets very sharp. Now, your hand's not that sharp. Your hand is definitely not that sharp. If I put it here, it's not. But right here is where you see the sharpest of the lines because your eyes focus on it that way. So by doing this very sharp, I think he's trying to show that the hand is very close. It's coming at you. If you look at this picture, it looks like that hand is coming to you. And I think he's very purposely making that sharp out of an acuity perspective to say Christ is blessing you. But here's the real trick. This is a crystal orb, solid crystal. It has the perfect inclusions in it, little things that are shown exactly scientifically right. Isabella d'Este, who's the richest woman in Italy, I was trying to get him to do a portrait. He wouldn't. He did Lisa instead. But she says, can you help me buy crystal? So he's doing it, and he's doing his optics, so he knows how lines hit mirrors and get refracted. Something weird about that. Look at this, or if you get a crystal orb, even better. If you look through something like that, it distorts my finger. It would distort this. Finger would even be upside down right here, right? Because that's the way optics works. This distorts nothing in Christ's robes. So there are three explanations. One is that Leonardo just didn't know that an orb, a crystal solid, would distort. I go, no. Here's about 20 notebook pages where he's actually showing lines being distorted in mirrors and lenses and everything else. The other explanation, which I sort of favored initially, is yes, he knew it should distort Christ's robes, but imagine he actually painted it that way. It would make this painting suck. I mean, it would just be horrible. You'd say, oh, it's a great painting, but well, what is happening down here? It would be distracting. The third explanation, which I didn't fully accept, but Luke Isaacson, who is now at the Met, when I asked him about it, nobody had really noticed this, and I'm like, so I'm asking all these experts. He has an explanation, which is, and I don't know the Bible verse exactly, but it's that there's a miracle, and that Christ's shepherding of our world shows no distortion.
So let me stop you. You said nobody had really noticed this. Are you saying that you're asking these questions of scholars because you've seen things that they have not noted?
Well, on the crystal orb, yes, generally.
Does it not amaze you that you wandered into this subject as an interloper and you've now...
Well, I mean, to be fair to all the experts, this painting was not famous until about 10 years ago. Right. And nobody in those 10 years was sitting there reading the notebook pages on how I get lenses to focus the light from the sun, et cetera, and to make mirrors. And I don't think people had focused on the fact that a crystal orb would distort, and Leonardo would know that.
All right, that's very Leonardo-esque of you. I'm being told that we are going
way over time.
Where we got to go to questions from the audience.
Okay.
So we got 15 minutes, 20 minutes for that. So why don't we?
We have all night.
Why don't we open it up?
We're from New Orleans. We'll be there till midnight.
Yes, so if you just raise your hand, I'll bring the microphone to you. Just a quick reminder, around here, questions start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are typically short. We do not believe in two-part questions, and only Michael Lewis gets to ask follow-up questions.
Thank you. Hi. At the beginning, you talked about how you wrote about some great, amazing men. Have you ever thought about writing about amazing women? And if so,
Yeah.
What woman would that be?
I wrote a book called The Innovators, which none of you have heard of because it didn't do all that well, but I think I probably sent Michael a free copy, which is basically begins and ends and has as a through line Ada Lovelace. And it's about the computer revolution. It begins with Ada Lovelace, Lord Byron's daughter, who, once again, is at the intersection of poetry, because her father's a poet, but also she's a mathematician like her mother. And so she comes up with the notion of a general-purpose computer. I won't go into that whole rap. But she also says machines will be able to do everything except think. So when Alan Turing does the imitation game, he says there's Lady Lovelace's objection, which that machines will never think. This becomes a theme, still to today, of can machines think? And so the beginning of the book, and then a through line, and the end of the book is Ada Lovelace. I probably could have and maybe should have written just a pure biography of her. I tried to. There's just not that much material. She published only one article in her time. I'm going to do a book maybe next. Should I talk about it? No? Maybe, I don't know what people feel about it. It's not part of these Genius series. I'm moving back to New Orleans. I want to do something on Lulu White. She was an octoroon who passed as black and passed as white en passant, as we called it in New Orleans in the 1890s, at her leisure whenever she wanted to. And she started Mahogany Hall, which was the best bordello and sporting house in what was then known as Storyville in the 1890s. And there are 3 or 4 other grand sporting houses, but this was the one that was the most popular because you could cross the race line. And that was a complicated thing in New Orleans growing up, and the Creole Society, and the Octoroon balls, etc. She also believed that it was more than just a sexual house. She has music, so she hires Jelly Roll Morton to be her professor piano player, who hires Louis Armstrong at age 12 to be the cornetist, and so it becomes a cradle of jazz. Among the things that happens is she has a friend who's also an octoroon, who lives in the district, named Homer W. Plessy, who at one point on Basin Street, famous Basin Street Blues, where he lives, boards a train at the Press Street station, and as an octoroon, refuses to sit in the colored car. The upshot, as you may know, is Plessy v. Ferguson, and the wrong side wins. And they have to draw a color line, which Lulu White refuses to do, meaning you can't, they segregate it, all these things. And so this is a book about race, sex, jazz, and all that jazz, and the drawing of the color line and how that screwed up America.
How often do you get that question? How come you haven't written more about women?
Almost every event I speak at.
Can we go to the next
I
one?
might just like quickly do, Madame Curie or something just to end the questioning. Because if I do Lulu White, I think people will say, that's not quite the same. Five geniuses and a bordello owner. But I'll be in New Orleans. I'll be immune to criticism.
Hey there. Hi. Apparently, Leonardo produced much more than we have. Is that the case? And is there a chance, do you think?
Apparently Leonardo produced much more than we have.
Is there a chance we'll uncover some of that?
Well, we know most of what he produced, including Salvator Mundi. We knew it existed. I would guess that in the next 50 years, it's possible another painting will show up. We know he did Leda and the Swan, but we haven't been able to find.
You surmise that his lover ended up with Leda.
Yeah, Salai was his first lover. Salai means the little devil because he kept stealing things, including he's the one who spills the wine.
It would be hard
on Vitruvian Man.
Hard to believe that he didn't steal.
Right, so he nicks a whole lot of them, and then he gets killed in a crossbow fight or something. So
which one did?
One did back then, and there's his estate, and of course he's a bit of a scam artist, so he claims to have the Mona Lisa, the real one, in his estate, which causes a lot of this confusion involving the eyebrows and everything. Oh, like, where's the real Mona Lisa? So I do think there may be in existence no more than 4 or 5, because we kind of know what he finished and what we're missing, of pure oil paintings that could someday show up. And I tell you, you write a book like this, I'm being hounded a bit by, art collectors in Hong Kong who claim they have the real Mona Lisa and stuff. And they'll fly me privately, send a jet for me to go to Hong Kong so that I can authenticate. And I go, no, this is not my job. But on other things, not too long, 40, 50 years ago, the 2 notebooks, now known as the Madrid notebooks, the Codices Madrid, were found in the Madrid National Library where they had been for like 300 years miscatalogued.
Do you think it's likely there are other notebooks that will show up?
Oh, I'm sure other notebooks will emerge. And pages, because what happens is he actually has 2 male companions, Salai, who nicked many of the pictures, but Melzi, a more aristocratic, his second companion, who kept all of his papers. And Melzi was pretty good and compiled a published version of the treatise on painting, where he does all that. But eventually, back in the old days, like Lord Elgin is wandering around Europe stealing the marbles from the Parthenon, and minor British aristocrats or going to, Florence and buying from Melzi, like the anatomy drawings, which end up then in Windsor Castle eventually. So some of them get scattered. Only 1/4, I think, I've estimated, of his notebook pages do we now still have. And I suspect of that other 3/4, a percentage of that is somewhere still available. That said, people go, isn't that a shame? I tried to get Steve Jobs' memos, notes, and emails from the 1990s with him, and he did it on the NeXT computer. You're the only person who remembers what a NeXT computer was. Even with like 2 tech people in his bedroom, we're trying to get him. There was no way to retrieve those emails or memos.
It's amazing how much survives of Leonardo.
Right, and so it proves that paper is a very good information storage technology.
Was there ever a big business in Leonardo forgeries?
Oh, I think there still is, and there are people, not me, who will say, the Bella Principessa, the one you talked about first, everybody thought that was a forgery. And until it finally gets authenticated, there are a lot of people forging Leonardo's and doing it very well, taking old vellum, that had...
So that is going on.
Oh, yeah. And Martin Kemp, who was one of the people who really helped me, a wonderful old Don at Oxford, has a great book out on some of the background to the Mona Lisa a year or so ago. He says he gets called upon once every month or two where somebody has something that's either a forgery or not. And he said they're almost all forgeries.
It's a really compromised business because the people who are in the business of authenticating, they get paid more if they say yes than if they say no.
And that's what happened to this guy in Canada. He used to get paid if you say yes. And likewise, if you're part of a consortium and you're the art dealer and you do it, which is why somebody like Martin Kemp at Oxford is so good, because he never takes money. So at least you can trust that he's saying what he believes. It used to be the field of connoisseurs, which I mean not just people who like art, but they're Bernard Berenson and Kenneth Clark, and they would just look, oh, that's a Leonardo.
They were the baseball scouts of art.
And so you write Moneyball, which is about people who think, I can feel it.
Right.
And they get supplanted, just like in Moneyball, by people who say, wait, I can do infrared and ultraviolet multispectral analysis to show exactly how many paintbrush layers they are and what the primer coat was and whether the primer coat had lead in it and whether, all these things which make a mockery of half the connoisseurs who turned out not to know what they were talking about. So
anyway.
Next question.
Where are we? Someone wave.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
A voice.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship and attitude of Leonardo towards Michelangelo?
Oh, that's great.
Oh, man. We were talking about it. That should be the movie.
Michelangelo was an asshole.
Yeah.
That's the gist of it. It's unbelievable what a jerk this guy was.
Yeah, he's a total jerk. He is the opposite in so many ways from Leonardo, which is he has no friends. He's a total recluse. He instead of dressing like a dandy, let's remind ourselves there's Leonardo dressing like a dandy. Michelangelo dresses only in black, sleeps in his boots and his clothes, whatever. And 20 years or so, about 20 years younger, they live in Florence. Leonardo's fine with Michelangelo. They're both gay, but for Michelangelo, he has the agony and the ecstasy, and he's like tormented by it, whereas Leonardo is like, fine. But Michelangelo disses Leonardo 2 or 3 times in public, where they run across each other, where Leonardo's got his whole entourage, and Salai, and Melzi, and all of his friends.
Makes fun of the horse.
And Leonardo, I think, trying to be somewhat friendly, asked him whatever question they were discussing. I can't remember what it was. And Michelangelo says, you who couldn't even build the horse in Milan, you do it yourself, and stalks away. And everybody says, what an asshole, I think was your technical term for it. Art historians have terms. Yeah. So among the other things that happens is, of course, Michelangelo sculpts David. And Leonardo's on the committee to figure out where do we put David. And he says, man, Leonardo is saying, don't put him right in the heart of the plaza. the Uffizi, it wasn't called the Uffizi then, but under the archways will be better, where it's not as prominent. And of all the weird things that Leonardo does, he even says we have to put a decent ornament, decente ornamente, on him because it's a little too intrusive, his genitalia. And so that's a fig leaf. This is a Leonardo drawing in his notebook from the meetings where they're trying to decide what to do. And actually for 40 years, he's displayed, David is put out there, and they put a brass fig leaf on him because Leonardo's Leonardo. He wins the argument.
You would never guess which one was in the closet.
Yeah. Which is weird because we didn't go through it, but I mean, Leonardo, who loves his boyfriends, there's Salai, for example, he's not particularly prudish about, painting, nudes, but some reason he's sick of this guy, Michelangelo, and wants to put a decent ornament on him. They also have different philosophies of painting. As I said, Leonardo blurred every line because he knew that's how we see nature. This is a typical Michelangelo, which is very sharp lines, which Leonardo ends up winning. Sfumato, as Michael said, becomes the style, but they did not get along. And it's sort of an All About Eve type rivalry of the younger, passionate but messed up younger artist trying to supplant, the great master.
Let's go up to the balcony for a question.
Way up there.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about your work style? How were you able to write this book amongst the other things going on in your life?
That's a great question. Everybody wonders when on earth you write these things.
I write
you run
at
the
night.
Aspen Institute. You're on boards all over.
He's been to the Aspen Institute, and the dirty little secret is it kind of runs itself. It's not the hardest job in America. It's fun. When I ran CNN, I had a period where I didn't write books. It was tough. I'm sorry to say this in Los Angeles, but the one little life hack I have is after I left CNN, which I didn't enjoy that much, CNN, I got rid of TV sets, and we have never had a TV set since then. So that gives you like 3 or 4 hours a night. I shouldn't say this because half the people here are TV producers. But it's amazing how much more time you have. And like some people, I like watching sports occasionally, the Saints. But I'll go to the corner, on Dumaine and Royal, the bar there, and you watch with other people, and then you go home, and you're not sitting there then trying to watch, 7 other NFL games. I work at night from about 9 p.m. to 1 or 2 a.m., but I'm not some Iron Man. I like sleeping 7 or 8 hours a night. When I was at CNN, we used to have the morning meeting at 7 a.m., which was uncivilized. One of the things I did say at the Aspen Institute is that no good idea ever occurs before 9 a.m. Nobody has to get in until 9:30, and so I've been okay. Yeah.
But
By the way, Michael writes more books than I do.
No.
This is all crazy.
So,
his Undoing project, which, by the way, I'm going to give you a tout, is like the guy wins a Nobel Prize, not Dubner, but that whole concept just wins it with Thaler, the idea of behavioral economics that's pushing that book, and it comes out in paperback in 3 weeks. So make sure you get the Undoing
totally
project.
Unnecessary.
No, but it's totally true. I love the Undoing project,
so,
and it's about Tversky and Kahneman. Dan Kahneman, it's a buddy movie, but unlike Michelangelo and Leonardo.
And they only screw each other's ideas. That's the other thing.
I won't go there.
But for the, you must have been all over the world looking at these notebooks.
Oh, yeah.
So when does that happen?
Well, this is not a hardship. Those notebooks are in Venice, Milan, Florence, Paris, Madrid, Windsor Castle, and London and Seattle. So even Seattle is bearable.
Did anybody have any misgivings about giving you access to the
No,
stuff?
I think everybody was totally. The Seattle one, as I said, was Bill Gates, who bought the Codex Leicester. And that was sort of at the beginning of this process. I should know, I can't remember, but it seems like it was about 10 years ago. And he was very excited by it and would he had it in glass cases now in his house. And he kept saying to me, nobody's ever written about him connecting the notebooks to his art. I am quite grateful to him, and especially his curator, a guy named Fred Schroeder, and others, because they're doing a annotated, translated version of the Codex Leicester, and they're taking forever, but it will be published next year. But they gave me access to it, and their experts sort of help guide me through the Codex Leicester chapter and do the translations better.
So, Ted, are we done? Is that what you're saying?
Just
back
one
here?
more question.
One more question.
Thanks. In the Salvator Mundi picture, there seems to be a striking asymmetry between the two sides of Christ's face. What's up with that?
Same with the Mona Lisa. First of all, the Mona Lisa, which I can go back to, has both an asymmetry and even the landscape is slightly higher. And I think it's partly because everything that Leonardo did, he wanted to show it in motion. He wants that right hand that's blessing you to be in motion. And there's a sense of motion that comes when somebody's going to turn slightly, and it creates an asymmetry. And I do think there was actually once a background there. I don't think it was all black. This has been badly restored over the years. And even the thing I did bring to this party was not art connoisseurship, since I never had the privilege of being an art history major at Princeton like you. But in fact, I don't think I got into Princeton. But I could notice more scientific details like the orb. And I'll just give you the last one. And this is Leonardo wants us to notice things. He wants us to observe. He wants us to figure out the dragonfly wings or the tongue of the woodpecker. But the eyes, what Leonardo knows is that if somebody's in light, the pupil gets smaller. We all know that. In a couple of his paintings, including this one, but also in the Mona Lisa and most noticeably in Ginevra da Benci, one pupil is slightly smaller than the other. Why? I think it's because he's trying to show they've turned from the light on this side into the shade, and you want to feel, if you really, really are being observant, you want to feel, oh, I get it, that pupil is a little bit more dilated than the other pupil. And then sometimes when I'm doing that, like looking at the musician where the pupil seems to be dilated the wrong way, because the one in light isn't as much, and I'm thinking, okay, then I think maybe I've learned too much from Leonardo. I've become too obsessed by trying to observe every detail like he would and connect the science to the art.
So it's absolutely true that right now, Peyton Manning and Eli Manning are more famous than you are. Yeah. 100 years from now, no one will remember who they were.
This is totally not true. Totally not true.
Thank you, Walter Isaacson.
Thank you.